So, what's Asia? Asia doesn't really exist. Well, I mean, of course it does. There's a continent on the map called Asia. Okay, fine. But what is it really? What binds or unites Siberia to Indonesia, Turkey to Japan? You could say, back in history there was this thing called the Silk Road and it travelled from east to west. Yeah, for some parts of Asian history, sure. I mean, it goes to Europe. Julius Caesar wears silk tunics, silk togas before he gets stabbed, all of this. We know that well-rehearsed story. It unites Europe and Asia. You could argue that there's a whole continent called Eurasia as well. But what's Asia then? What's the Asia bit of it? And is Turkey in Europe or Asia? I don't want to get into that because, of course, it will get me on the hate mail. But for the Greeks who give us the name Asia, it starts in Turkey, right? Turkey is quintessentially Asia. Anything east of that is also Asia. Quite simple. Of course, Russia then comes into the picture. Russia gets complicated later on. So Europe ends at the Ural Mountains and Asia begins there. Fine. We can take these semi-arbitrary starting points for a continent if we would like. But then naming one thing, well, naming something geographically is one thing. So we've named Asia. It exists. But what is an Asian then? From Turks to Indonesians, indigenous Siberians to Japanese, everything in between, that's an Asian. So, of course, that would mean that Asians don't look like anything. There's no one way to look Asian. Now, a lot of people, especially in the 21st century and especially in the United States, say, oh, to look Asian means to look like the typical Chinese person or the averaged out Japanese person or Korean, maybe Vietnamese, something like this. In the UK, there's still the very common usage of Asian to mean from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. Although, of course, it also could refer to, say, China, Japan, Korea. But, of course, in theory, it could refer to the Middle East. But we tend to use the Middle East as a specialized sort of term for that. Okay, the Middle East is there. It's quite logical. It's the Middle East from the perspective of Europe. Fine. You know, English has its origins in Europe. It's not unlikely that would inherit such a term. Of course, a lot of these are very, very Eurocentric. Which, of course, every language sort of has these terms that come from the culture that speak this language. So, of course, you know, there are many Eurocentric terms in European languages, of course, because they are in Europe. So, of course, they are their own center, right? And everything expands out from there, and that's the whole world. So, of course, in especially ancient China, of course, China's the center of the world, right? To this day, China is the middle kingdom, right? Or the middle country, middle land, whatever. But increasingly, of course, we use these Western terms because they've become the kind of scientific terms. So Asia is now a concept that exists within Asia itself. Of course, it never did before, right? Because it was just a place. It was just there, or it was just these other land masses, or was constructed from there going out, right? So I think for a global sort of knowledge-building community, it's perhaps helpful to not use the only Eurocentric ones. Not because they don't have a historical reason for being so or whatever, but just because they're not as useful, frankly, for a globalized world. Also, if you're in former European colonies, which are now countries, does it make sense for you to talk about things from a European perspective when you're not in Europe? So if you're in North America or South America or Australia, somewhere else like that, does it really make sense for you to use something like the Middle East or Asia in a way that Europeans did? I mean, we've inherited it across the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean we need to. And then, of course, what is it to be an Asian whatever person or an Asian culture? What is that? What unifies that? That's a really interesting thing. Is there something called Asia? For my money, there's not currently. There's not something called Asia, apart from on our maps. But it is interesting to see if such a thing evolves. Over the centuries, there has and hasn't been such a thing called Europe, really, either. But for enough of European history, there's something you could discern as being somehow European, especially in recent times. And now I think it is logical to talk about something like Europe, something of that nature. Just as there is actually some reason to talk about South America, there is a lot of exchange, especially now. Perhaps not before. I mean, there was exchange, but was there unity of enough big polities going, okay, we're South American? No, of course not. Especially not pre-colonial, Spanish colonial and Portuguese colonial or French or British or whatever in South America. Don't even get me started on Africa. But this video is not about these other places. This is just a way to say, okay, let's compare with the rest of the world. Going back to Asia, the amount of different ways you can look Asian, quote unquote, from, as I say, from the borders of Europe to the borders of the Pacific, from Siberia to nearly Australia, right? There are a lot of different ways to look Asian, to act Asian, to eat Asian food, to do all of this. And much more diverse than within Europe, because again, Europe is already a more problematic concept than we often give it credit for. What is Europe? Where do the boundaries lie? What does it mean to do something in a European way? But yet, Europe is a much smaller continent, or, you know, part of a continent if you want to make Eurasia a continent. But if Europe is a continent, and a cultural zone, is Asia a continent and a cultural zone? I would say no. There's no way that Asia is one giant cultural zone. There are lots of interconnections, but humans connect themselves with other humans all throughout history, time, and space. So that's not uncommon, right? People are always in contact when they get the chance, you know, unless they have a policy of not, like say Japan shut itself off for a while, but it was still in contact with some groups. So, like I said, for my money, there's no real unifying Asianness. There's no sort of platonic form of Asia. So where does that leave us? I would say it's much more interesting, it's much better to talk about things in a more specific way. And in terms of macro regions, the Sinosphere, the old Sinosphere, where China used to be the head of a particular sort of arrangement whereby China was on top, right? And you had other polities such as Korea or Vietnam being, you know, under China and Japan, etc., and others, you know, tributaries, etc., this Confucian tributary system. That was one sphere, and it had moving parts, and it expanded and contracted a bit, but it was fairly stable, actually. Quite stable, actually, and that Sinosphere lasts culturally, I would say, until today. A lot of actually what Americans mean by Asian would be summed up easily in the Sinosphere, and a lot of what Brits mean by Asia when they say things like, okay, you know, British Asia, meaning someone of, say, Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi descent, for instance, in the UK, they mean a sort of Indian subcontinent, as it's been called, right? That old macro idea of India. That's sort of what they mean, right? And these regions make sense because these regions are been in contact with each other for a long time. This makes sense. But beyond that, Central Asia, sure, the steppe lands have always been in contact with each other, but all the way to Europe, of course. It doesn't necessarily have to end where the boundaries of Asia end. And then Japan is sometimes in the Sinosphere, in fact quite often, but it's also kind of the periphery. It has a bit more of a problematic relationship with it. You know, does something like, is Tibet more in the Sinosphere? Well, no, but is it the same really as the Indic sphere? Maybe not, you know. So I'd say there are always border cases. The thing is, hard and fast categories are hard to come by in these sorts of terms. But one unified Asia for sure does not exist. And if it does in future, that's interesting. That will be a change from thus far, up until this point in history. That will be a change. And of course, this isn't a value statement. It's not saying it should or not change. I'm just saying, for my money, there's no unifying concept here. So I think it's a lot more descriptive. I think we give each other a lot more information when we talk about these regions, or of course specific countries, ethnic groups, languages, cultural practices, and we're a bit more specific instead of sort of semi-lazily just saying Asia, as if that clarifies something. Do you like Asian food? Yeah, I love Asian food. Oh, so we're eating Turkish tonight? No, I thought we were eating Chinese. Okay, you see my point. Obviously, in everyday parlance, that's not how people always use it, for instance. But I do think that for a large part of conversation, especially when we start talking about politics or history or anything like this, where we need to be a bit more serious in defining our terms, it may well be helpful to do so. Thanks for attending this sort of rambly, impromptu mini lecture on this, but I hope it's some food for thought. Take care. Bye.